Well, hello, strangers. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. Climb in. We're going for a drive because I have to tell you this crazy thing that happened. This true, original, scary story. Number 152. When I was younger, my brother signed up for an exchange student program. He ended up going to England, and we ended up getting a guest in the form of a taciturn young man named Yuri. He was so unlike the other boys I'd seen. Boys that delighted in booger jokes and sticking cold, squirmy things down your back. They called it worming. Very creative. But Yuri was different. He was serious, stoic, almost a statue under his short, sharp blonde hair and equally sharp features. And I was a smitten kitten for him. Unfortunately, just like he didn't have any time for the foolishness of worming the girls, he sure as hell didn't have time for the foolishness of some lovesick puppy following him around the house. Still, he was polite, and he stayed on for a few weeks. My older brother ended up spending the most time with him, but whenever I could, I would tag along. We lived in a city, and when it came to recreation and things we could do, well, there was a park. But the park was kind of sketchy, drug dealers and stuff. So my mom always sent us to the Y instead. The Y had a pool, and I was pretty good at swimming. The funny thing was the Y itself required us to get on a bus and ride out to near the outskirts of town. I don't know why my mom thought it was safer for us to go beyond walking distance away, but this was the 90s. To get to the Y, we had to pass sort of a empty lot rural situation. There were some scattered trees there, along with all the usual detritus that you'd expect from litter bugs and homeless people. Cans glinted in the sun, plastic bags flapping around on the outstretched branches of the trees, reaching up, as though to ask God, why have I been planted here? Calgon, take me away. That kind of thing. It was walking past this field one day when I heard it. A buzzing. Now, I had just read a book, one that you might be familiar with, Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe. In it, Iggy is a bee charmer. That particular picture was stuck in my head as I stopped there on the sidewalk, scanning around, wondering which of the trees might actually be cracked open to contain piles of golden honeycomb around which surely that buzzing was emanating. I noted it in my head. At my age, it was hard to come by information that was interesting and that everybody else didn't already have. And I was already planning on wowing Yuri with my well-read intellect, being able to put together something as simple as buzzing with this concept that I had read about in a book. Surely he'd be impressed. Maybe he'd even want to go see it. I was so excited thinking about it that I don't even remember the why or going swimming. Well, my plans were dashed. By the time I got back home, Yuri and my older brother had been invited to a sleepover, so my discovery would have to wait until the following day. When it did, I begged, insisted, that Yuri come with me to the Y. Both he and my brother finally relented, thanks to my mom getting involved, and off we went on the bus. When we got to the bus stop, I was bouncing ahead, insisting that Yuri was going to be so excited. I was also already imagining him in the role of Iggy, stoically and calmly pulling honeycombs out of a log and handing them to me, maybe finally seeing me as worthwhile and interesting. When we got to the field, the buzzing was frantic, thick. My mind boggled. Maybe there was more than one hive. Maybe we'd wandered into some sort of bee sanctuary. I was so excited I was tugging on my brother's shirt, telling him, See, I told you, there's bees. No. From ahead, Yuri, standing still on the sidewalk, finally looked at me. His expression was cold, blank. He shook his head once, as though I hadn't heard him, and then repeated himself. No, is not bees. No, I couldn't believe it. I'd been holding so tightly to this daydream I wouldn't believe it. I clambered forward and I insisted, pleaded with him. No, it was bees. He just needed to go look. Until he finally gripped both of my wrists away from him, looking me dead in the eye with his ice flint eyes, told me that while he didn't expect much from silly Americans, surely I could tell the sound of a bee from a fly. Flies. Suddenly, my concept of a tree trunk full of glistening honey was replaced by dead roadkill somewhere in a clump of asters. I shuddered, but now my older brother was far more interested. The latent poke dead things with a stick gene had been activated in him, and he was charging forward. Yuri followed close behind, but none of the excitement followed on his face. Just something like resignation? Recognition. We tromped through the fields. There was a clump of trees on the south corner, and as we got there, I could start to see that what I had taken for dark green foliage was actually alive. A buzzing cloud of flies. It was indeed centered around the trees. I was already covering my nose before I could even smell anything, knowing full well that we were going to discover somebody's pet. Hopefully died of natural causes, but again, 90s, city, who knew? I was staring at the ground, trying hard not to breathe in anything, suddenly imagining breathing in the very flies that seemed to make the air around me alive, when I bumped directly into Yuri's back. At the same moment, I heard a sound come from my brother. A gasp, a yowl, something wretched, shocked. I snapped my head up just as Yuri turned. He was planning to shield me from the sight, but in that brief glimpse I saw it. It was not a pet. It was not a cat or a dog or a possum. It was a man. A man was hanging from one of the trees. He was covered in flies, but I could still see his face, still see the image of the dark spots where his mouth, eyes, and the soft tissue of his note, and then Yuri had me in his arms. I was hyperventilating, not crying, just gasping. My brain wouldn't catch up. I buried my face in Yuri's shirt, but my eyes were wide open. I felt like I couldn't shut them, because when I shut them, I saw that dark jack-o'-lantern mockery of a person's face. So distraught was I that it wasn't until much later I realized I'd finally gotten what I'd only dreamed of in my deepest daydreams. Yuri hugging me. This was before people carried phones. We had to walk to the Y and ask to use their phone. When asked who we were calling and our response being the police, you can imagine more questions followed. By the time the police showed up, there was a pretty large crowd gathered over by the trees. Not us, though. I wouldn't go near it. My mom came, bustled us all away in the aging Volvo that was a permanent fixture in my childhood memories. By now, the tears and waterworks had happened, both for me and my brother. Sat between us, though, Yuri just looked frozen, blank. It was the first time I'd ever seen a dead body, and so far the last. But I can still see it clearly, and even writing this gives me the heebie-jeebies. I know my brother was impacted by it too. But that's not the scary part of this story. The scary part was Yuri. Yuri was no more than 11. And my bratty attempts to get him to open up and tell me about himself aside, we didn't know much about what it was like where he lived. But given the reaction of an 11-year-old boy coming across a corpse in a field, and the absolute non-response he gave, it seems to me the real horror story is whatever happened to him, that corpse was nothing at all, barely a register. He left soon after, and my brother returned, and life went on as normal. But like an inky bookmark that leaves a stain in the book that it's placed in, I'll never forget that afternoon. I'll never forget the buzzing, and I'll never forget how familiar the sight appeared to Yuri. Well, well, well. Lucky you. You've stumbled across another secret story. Halloween 2008. I was 19, at college, away from home for the first time. For Halloween, I went on a date. I dressed as a mermaid. And Kyle came as an asshole, basically himself. The date itself is its own sort of horror story, but where it really matters is when I was trying to get away. See, most of the time you can extricate yourself from a bad date by faking going to the bathroom or texting a friend to call you and pretend that there's an emergency. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that my date seemed to catch on to every one of them, probably because other girls had had to use these means to get away from him before. It got so bad that I tried to literally bolt from the restaurant in front of him and away from him down a street. But like he was expecting me to run, like he was anticipating it, he was hot on my heels. Now we were in a dangerous cat and mouse game. Like I said, Halloween, lots of people out, and he couldn't risk looking like an aggressor. So we'd play this game where when people were wandering or stumbling by, he would act funny and cute and goofy, calling after me like, "Hey, wait up, not all of us are such good swimmers," and so on, only to drop the pretense of the fun act the second that the passerby were out of earshot, calling me little girl and telling me that I wasn't going to get away. I was just delaying the inevitable. I might as well just come with him now. It'd be so much easier. I was new enough to the town that I got turned around. I was just trying to get away from him, taking lefts and rights with no idea as to where I was actually going. When I finally rounded a corner and ran smack into what I can only assume was some fraternity spin on a parade meets SpongeBob SquarePants. There must have been 20 guys, all with wheelbarrows. Each wheelbarrow was full of either cases or kegs of beer or girls dressed in swimwear, mermaid outfits like mine. And, standing out from them all, a girl dressed like Sandy Cheeks. As I glanced around, I saw most of the guys were dressed in some approximation of SpongeBob themselves, but it was the Sandy Cheeks girl that I locked eyes with. Bless her heart, she took it all in 1 second, leaned up and told the boy, who was dressed as SpongeBob, something, then motioned over to me with one long arm movement. I ran to her, and as she shifted over, she insisted I climb in with her. I looked at the SpongeBob guy to make sure that he was okay with this, not sure that I wanted to drag them into whatever my date was planning. But he was looking around, placid and with a big smile, like this didn't bother him at all. I was barely in the wheelbarrow and turned around when I saw my date come around the corner, and like a tractor beam, he locked onto me. He started directly at me, then seemed to take in the rest of the crowd and sort of eased up. His walk became less intense, but still focused, as he came directly towards us. I was cringing against the girl dressed as Sandy, but she snaked an arm around my shoulders and squeezed it once, and then raising her voice, cried out that the landlubber better get back on the sidewalk because the street was ocean. This halted my date in his tracks, but only for a moment. He opened his mouth, advancing towards me, arm outstretched to pull me from the wheelbarrow. Right on cue, the SpongeBob guy pushing the wheelbarrow pivoted left, and throwing his head back, cried out, "Are you ready, kids?" And around us, the rest of his fraternity cried out, "Aye, aye, Captain." I watched my date flounder, then try to raise his voice, try to reason with the SpongeBob pushing the wheelbarrow I was in. The SpongeBob guy was having none of it. He turned his head until he was face to face, near nose to nose with my date, and then screamed into his face, "I can't hear you." And around us, The Greek chorus responded, "Aye, aye, Captain." I think at that point Kyle realized he was outmatched. I watched his face contort, flatten, and then fade as the cavalcade of SpongeBob SquarePantses, Patrick Stars, Mr. Krabs, and Squidwards shuttled us past him, leaving him there on the side of the road as their singing filled the night. It was slurry. It was off-key. It was one of the best sounds I've ever heard. So yes, that date was indeed one of the most horrific close calls I've ever had. Who knows what could have happened to me if not for the intervention of a jointly hosted sorority fraternity SpongeBob SquarePants Halloween parade. Until next time, stay strange and stay safe, strangers.